So in this video, we're going to multiply and divide some radicals. So the only time you can multiply and divide radicals is when they have the same index. So we're always looking at that number in the armpit of the radical and making sure that it is the same. If it is the same, you put them under one radical, still with that same number, and then you multiply them. Or if they're being divided and they have the same index, you can put it under one tall radical with a fraction underneath. But remember, you can only do this if the index is the same. So let's get to it. Actually, let's do kind of an easier one first. These ones all have letters. Let's just do something easy, like let's do the square root of 8 times the square root of 2. Okay, so if I'm going to do the square root of 8 times the square root of 2, first thing I'm going to do is check their index. Now notice there's no number in the index, so what does that tell us? Hopefully you remember that tells us the index is 2, so we can multiply these together. So we put them under one index, and we multiply them together. So what's 8 times 2? Well, that is 16. Then we look to see, can we take the square root of 16? And yes, you can use a calculator or your brain. The square root of 16 is 4. So that's what you're going to do on most of these. Multiply the numbers together and then see if you can take the square root. If you can't take the square root, you may have to make a factor tree just like we did on 6.1. So let's move on to a little bit more challenging ones. So here's a couple that are a little bit more challenging. So this one, firstly, we look to see if they have the same index. Yes, they do. The index, when there's nothing written there, do you remember what the index is? Hopefully you remember that the index is 2. So what I'm going to do for these is put them under one radical with an index of 2. So I have 8y to the 5th times 40y to the 2nd. So now I'm actually going to multiply that. 8 times 40 is 320. Now the y's are a little bit more tricky. This says y to the 5th. That means I have 5 y's. This says y to the 2nd. That means I have 2 y's. So if I have 5 y's and here I have 2 y's, that means together I have 7 y's. When you have exponents, you add them when you're multiplying. Okay, so can I take the square root of 320? I certainly cannot. You could try on your calculator, but it'll give you a decimal, and Math Excel will not accept a decimal. So we have to make a factor tree of 320. Let me do that real quick. Okay, so here's my factor tree of 320, 8 and 40. Some of you may have gone, oh, it's going to divide by 32 and 10. That's fine. You can make your factor tree different than mine. They'll all end up being the same prime factorization at the bottom. So how many are we looking for in a group? Hopefully you remember that the index tells us how many we're looking for in a group. So I'm looking for 2 of the same kind. So there's 2 of the same kind, another 2 of the same kind, another 2 of the same kind. So for each circle, I write the number that's in the circle one time on the outside of my radical. Then down here, same thing, I circle, I circle, I circle. So I have 3 groups of y's. So letters are a little bit different. We write them one time with an exponent of the number of groups that they have. Then we do square root. What number is not in a circle is the 5. And how many letters do I have not under the circle? Just one y. Then once everything's where it should be placed, I multiply it together. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So 8y to the 3rd, square root of 5y. And that's all we have to do. This next one, we have a little bit more going on here. Do you see that there's a 3 on the outside and a 2 on the outside? I should do that in a different color. See that 3 and the 2 on the outside? When we multiply, that 3 and the 2 are going to get multiplied and become 6. Then I'm still going to multiply this stuff underneath. So underneath my radical, I have 5x to the 3rd and 50y to the 4th. So I'm going to multiply those together. So now I'm actually going to do the multiplication. So the 6 stays on the outside. Cube root. 5 times 50 is 250. We have x to the third and y to the fourth. And there weren't any other x's or any other y's to add. So what is our index? Our index is 3. So we're going to leave our 6 alone out here, but we're going to make a factor tree Sorry, my Chromebook just went wonky. We are going to make a factor tree of 250. And we are going to write out all the x's and all the y's. So let me do that. So my factor tree of 250 gave me 5, 5, 5, and 2. And I had 3 x's and 4 y's. So now I need to circle the stuff that I can circle. So if I look at my numbers, remember your index is 3, so I need a set of 3. There's 3 5s, so that can go on the outside. Looking now at my x's, it looks like there are 3 x's, so I have one group of x's to put out there. And the y's, I have 3 y's, so one group of y's to put out there. Now I have to put the stuff that didn't escape the radical, so the stuff that was not in a group. So there's a 2. No x's and 1 y, so 2y. Then finally, last but not least, we multiply everything together. So 6 times 5 is 30. The x and the y, this just chill. And we have the cube root of 2y. Now we're going to do some division. So with the division, since these are separate and I can't take the square root of 5, let's put them under one radical and see if they can divide, especially since the 5 is smaller than the 500. So 500 divided by 5. Well, can you do 500 divided by 5? Yeah, you can. 500 divided by 5 is 100. Does anybody know the square root of 100? The square root of 100 is 10. So my answer, well, one of them at least, is 10. But if you remember from yesterday, we talked about if your index is even, you have to have 2 answers. So the 10, you also have to have negative 10. Because of that even index, there's a 2 in there, even though it's not written. Okay, next one. Oh, yeah, that one's done. Then that's finished. The next one, same thing. Since the 24 is bigger than the 6, let's put them under one radical. Okay, let's see what we can divide. Does 24 divide by 6? Sure does. That's a 4. Okay, so here, when we're dividing with exponents, this means I have 5 x's. This means I have 3 x's. So remember from 8.6, we can cancel if they're the same thing. So what does that mean that I have? That means I have 2 x's left. Shortcut, just take this number and subtract that number. Okay, so now, well, can I take the square root of 4? Yep, it's 2. And if I have 2 x's and I need to group them into 2, that would just be 2x. But since this is an even index, I also have to have negative 2x. So both of those are my answers. Last thing on this video, rationalizing the denominator. When you're rationalizing the denominator, you cannot have a radical in the denominator. You also cannot have a fraction like we just did, 500 over 5. You cannot have a fraction under a radical. So you can't have what we have here, a radical in the denominator, and you can't have a fraction underneath a radical. So this is not okay because it has a radical in the denominator. So what we would do is multiply by that radical over itself. So what that would give us here is 5 times the square root of x, and this would be the square root of x squared. Now, if you remember from 6.1, if I have a radical with the same index as the power, they cancel. Well, this is a 2, and this index is a 2. So those cancel. So this ends up being 5 times the square root of x over x. And that's my final answer. After you've watched this video, go work on your 6.2 on Math Excel. Please, please, please let me know if you have questions.